Paddington in the Garden. This is by Michael Bond. One morning, Paddington went out into the garden and began making a list of all the nice things he could think of about being a bear and living with the Browns. He had a room of his own and a warm bed to sleep in. He had marmalade for breakfast every morning, and in darkest Peru he only had been allowed to have it on Sundays. The list was soon so long he had nearly run out of paper before he realized he had left one of the biggest, nicest things of all. The garden itself. Paddington liked the Browns' garden. Apart from the occasional noise from a nearby building site, it was so quiet and peaceful it didn't seem like being in London at all. But nice gardens don't just happen. They usually require a lot of hard work. And the one at number 32 Windsor Gardens was no exception. Mr. Brown had to mow the lawn twice a week, and Mrs. Brown was kept busy weeding the flower beds, and there was always something to do. Even Mrs. Bird lent a hand whenever she had a spare moment. It was Mrs. Bird who first suggested giving Jonathan, Judy, and Paddington each a piece of the garden. "It will keep certain bears out of mischief," she said, meaningly, "and it will be fun for Jonathan and Judy as well." Mr. Brown agreed it was a very good idea, and he marked out 3 plots at the far end of the lawn. Paddington was most excited. "I don't suppose there are many bears who have their own garden," he exclaimed. Early the next morning, all 3 set to work. Judy decided to make a flower bed, and Jonathan had his eye on some old paving stones. Paddington didn't know what to do. In the past, he had often found that gardening was much harder than it looked, especially when you only had paws. In the end, armed with a jar of Mrs. Bird's homemade marmalade, he borrowed Mr. Brown's wheelbarrow and set off to look for ideas. His first stop was a stall in the market where he bought a book called How to Plan Your Garden by Lionel Trugg. It came complete with a large packet of assorted seeds, and if the picture on the front cover was anything to go by, it was no wonder Mr. Trugg looked happy, for he seemed to do most of his planning while lying in a hammock. By the end of the book, without lifting a finger, he was surrounded by blooms. Paddington decided it was a very good value indeed, especially when the owner of the stall gave him 2 pence change. Mr. Trugg's book was full of useful hints and tips. The first one suggested that before you started working, it was a good idea to close your eyes and try to picture what the garden would look like when it was finished. Having walked into a lamp post by mistake, Paddington decided to read another page or 2. There he found a much better idea. Mr. Trugg advised standing back and looking at the site from a safe distance, preferably somewhere high up. By the time Paddington reached the building site near the Browns' house, it was the middle of the morning, and the men were all on their tea break. Placing his jar of marmalade on a wooden platform for safekeeping, he sat on a pile of bricks for a rest while he considered the matter. There was no one about, and there was a ladder nearby. Mr. Trugg was quite right. The Browns' garden did look very different from high up. But before he had time to get his breath back, Paddington heard the sound of an engine starting up. He peered through a gap in the boards, and as he did so his eyes nearly popped out. On the ground just below him a man was emptying a load of concrete on the very spot where he left his jar of marmalade. Paddington scrambled back down the ladder as fast as his legs would carry him, reaching the bottom just as the foreman came around the corner. "Is anything wrong? You look upset." Suddenly there was a... Oops. We have some pieces stuck together here. There we go. My jar's been buried, exclaimed Paddington hotly, pointing to the pile of concrete. It had some of Mrs. Bird's best golden chunks in it, too. Oh, I think they think it's gold. I want to ask how your jar got there, said the foreman, turning to Paddington as his men set to work clearing the concrete into small piles, or what you were doing up the ladder. Well, I'm glad of that, said Paddington politely, raising his hat. Suddenly there was a whirring sound from somewhere overhead, and to Paddington's surprise the platform landed at his feet. My marmalade, he exclaimed thankfully. Your marmalade? Repeated the foreman, staring at the jar. Did you say marmalade? That's right, said Paddington. I put it there ready for my 11s. It must have been taken up by mistake. Now the tops come off. It was the foreman's turn to look as though he could hardly believe his eyes. That's special quick-drying cement, he wailed. It's probably rock hard already, ruined by a bear's marmalade. No one will give me tuppence for it now. I will, said Paddington eagerly. I have an idea. Paddington was busy for the rest of the week. When the builders saw the rock garden he had made, they were most impressed, and the foreman even gave him some plants to finish it off until his seeds started to grow. It's National Garden Day on Saturday, he said. There are some very famous people judging it. I'll spread the word around. You never know your luck. The foreman was as good as his word, and on Saturday half the neighborhood turned up at number 32 Windsor Gardens to see the judges arrive. Paddington nearly fell over backwards with surprise when he discovered that no less a person than Mr. Lionel Trugg himself was leading the procession. It's very good of you to get out of your hammock, Mr. Trugg, he exclaimed. Not at all, said Lionel. My pleasure, I must say. I love your orange stones. Where did you find them? I didn't, said Paddington. I think they found me, thanks to the builders. Congratulations, said Mr. Trugg as he handed Paddington a gold star. It's good to see a young bear taking up gardening. I hope you'll be the first of many. Who would have believed it, said Mr. Brown, as the last of the crowd departed. You must write and tell Aunt Lucy all about it, said Mrs. Bird. They'll be very excited in the Home for Retired Bears when they hear the news. Paddington thought that was a good idea, but he had something to do first. He wanted to add one more important item to his list of all the nice things there were about being a bear and living with the Browns. Having my own rock garden. Then he signed his name and added his special paw print, just to show it was genuine.